A pike is a pole weapon, a very long thrusting spear formerly used extensively by infantry. Unlike many similar weapons, the pike is not intended to be thrown. Pikes were used regularly in European warfare from the early Middle Ages until around 1700, and wielded by foot soldiers deployed in close quarters. The pike found extensive use with lanzknecht armies and Swiss mercenaries, who employed it as their main weapon and used it in pike square formations. A similar weapon, the sarissa, was also used by Alexander the Great's Macedonian phalanx infantry to great effect. Generally, a spear becomes a pike when it is too long to be wielded with one hand in combat. Design. The pike was a long weapon, varying considerably in size, from 3 to 7.5 meters long. It was approximately 2.5–6 kilograms in weight, with 16th-century military writer Sir John Smythe recommending lighter rather than heavier pikes. It had a wooden shaft with an iron or steel spearhead affixed. The shaft near the head was often reinforced with metal strips called cheeks or languettes. When the troops of opposing armies both carried the pike, it often grew in a sort of arms race, getting longer in both shaft and head length to give one side's pikemen an edge in the combat. The extreme length of such weapons required a strong wood such as well-seasoned ash for the pole, which was tapered towards the point to prevent the pike from sagging on the ends. Although this was always a problem in pike handling, it is a common mistake to refer to a bladed polearm as a pike. Such weapons are more generally halberds, glaives or volgers. The great length of the pikes allowed a great concentration of spearheads to be presented to the enemy, with their wielders at a greater distance, but also made pikes unwieldy in close combat. This meant that pikemen had to be equipped with a shorter weapon such as a sword, mace, or dagger in order to defend themselves should the fighting degenerate into a melee. In general, however, pikemen attempted to avoid such disorganized combat, at which they were at a disadvantage. To compound their difficulties in a melee, the pikemen often did not have a shield or had only a small shield of limited use in close quarters fighting. Tactics. The pike, due to its unwieldy nature, was always intended to be used in a deliberate, defensive manner, often in conjunction with other missile and melee weapons. However, better trained troops were capable of using the pike in an aggressive attack, with each rank of pikemen being trained to hold their pikes so that they presented enemy infantry with 4 or 5 layers of spearheads bristling from the front of the formation. As long as it kept good order, such a formation could roll right over enemy infantry, but it did have weaknesses. The men were all moving forward facing in a single direction and could not turn quickly or efficiently to protect the vulnerable flanks or rear of the formation. The huge block of men carrying such unwieldy spears could be difficult to maneuver in any way other than straightforward movement. As a result, such mobile pike formations sought to have supporting troops protect their flanks or would maneuver to smash the enemy before they could be outflanked themselves. There was also the risk that the formation would become disordered, leading to a confused melee in which pikemen had the vulnerabilities mentioned above. According to Sir John Smythe, there were 2 ways for 2 opposing pike formations to confront one another: cautious or aggressive. The cautious approach involved fencing at the length of the pike, while the aggressive approach involved quickly closing distance, with each of the first 5 ranks giving a single powerful thrust. In the aggressive approach, the first rank would then immediately resort to swords and daggers if the thrusts from the first 5 ranks failed to break the opposing pike formation. Smythe considered the cautious approach laughable. Although primarily a military weapon, the pike could be surprisingly effective in single combat, and a number of 16th-century sources explain how it was to be used in a dueling situation. Fencers of the time often practiced with and competed against each other with long staves in place of pikes. George Silver considered the 18-feet pike one of the more advantageous weapons for single combat in the open. giving it odds over all weapons shorter than 8 feet or the sword and dagger, shield combination. Ancient use. Although very long spears had been used since the dawn of organized warfare, the earliest recorded use of a pike-like weapon in the tactical method described above involved the Macedonian sarissa, used by the troops of Alexander the Great's father, Philip II of Macedon, and successive dynasties, which dominated warfare for several centuries in many countries. After the fall of the last successor of Macedon, the pike largely fell out of use for the next 1,000 or so years. The one exception to this appears to have been in Germany, where Tacitus recorded Germanic tribesmen in the 2nd century AD as using overlong spears. He consistently refers to the spears used by the Germans as being massive and very long, suggesting that he is describing in essence a pike. Caesar, in his De Bello Gallico, describes the Helvetii as fighting in a tight, phalanx-like formation with spears jutting out over their shields. Caesar was probably describing an early form of the shield wall so popular in later times. Medieval revival. In the Middle Ages, the principal users of the pike were urban militia troops such as the Flemings or the peasant array of the Lowland Scots. For example, the Scots used a spear formation known as the Schiltran in several battles during the Wars of Scottish Independence, including the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and the Flemings used the Geldon long spear to absorb the attack of French knights at the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302. Before other troops in the Flemish formation counterattacked the stalled knights with golden dags. Both battles were seen by contemporaries as stunning victories of commoners over superbly equipped, mounted, military professionals, where victory was owed to the use of the pike and the brave resistance of the commoners who wielded them. These formations were essentially immune to the attacks of mounted men-at-arms as long as the knights obligingly threw themselves on the spear wall, and the foot soldiers remained steady under the morale challenge of facing a cavalry charge. But the closely packed nature of pike formations rendered them vulnerable to enemy archers and crossbowmen who could shoot them down with impunity, especially when the pikemen did not have adequate armor. Many defeats, such as at Ruselbeek and Halidon Hill, were suffered by the militia pike armies when faced by cunning foes who employed their archers and crossbowmen to thin the ranks of the pike blocks, before charging in with their men-at-arms. Medieval pike formations tended to have better success when they operated in an aggressive fashion. The Scots at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, for example, utilized the momentum of their charge to overrun an English army while the Englishmen were crossing a narrow bridge. At the Battle of Lorpen, Bernese pikemen overwhelmed the infantry forces of the opposing Habsburg Burgundian army with a massive charge before wheeling over to strike and rout the Austro-Burgundian horsemen as well. At the same time, however, such aggressive action required considerable tactical cohesiveness or suitable terrain to protect the vulnerable flanks of the pike formations, especially from the attack of mounted man-at-arms. When these features not available, medieval militia pikes often suffered costly failures such as at battles of Mons and Pevel Castle, Ruselbeek and Uthie. The constant success of the Swiss mercenaries in the later period was attributed to their extreme discipline and tactical unity due to semi-professional nature, allowing a pike block to somewhat alleviate the threat presented by flanking attacks. It was not uncommon for aggressive pike formations to be composed of dismounted men-at-arms, as at the Battle of Sempach, where the dismounted Austrian vanguard, using their lances as pikes, had some initial success against their predominantly halberd-equipped Swiss adversaries. Dismounted Italian men-at-arms also used the same method to defeat the Swiss at the Battle of Arbedo. Equally, well-armoured Scottish nobles were recorded as forming the leading ranks of Scottish pike blocks at the Battle of Flodden, incidentally rendering the whole formation resistant to English archery. Renaissance heyday. The Swiss solved the pike's earlier problems and brought a renaissance to pike warfare in the 15th century. establishing strong training regimens to ensure they were masters of handling the spears on maneuvers and in combat. They also introduced marching to drums for this purpose. This meant that the pike blocks could rise to the attack, making them less passive and more aggressive formations, but sufficiently well trained that they could go on the defensive when attacked by cavalry. German soldiers known as Landsknechts later adopted Swiss methods of pike handling. The Scots predominantly used shorter spears in their schiltron formation. Their attempt to adopt the longer continental pike was dropped for general use after its ineffective use led to humiliating defeat of the Battle of Flodden. Such Swiss and Landsknecht phalanxes also contained men armed with two-handed swords, or Zweihander, and halberdiers for close combat against both infantry and attacking cavalry. The Swiss were confronted with the German Landsknecht, who used similar tactics as the Swiss, but more pikes in the more difficult Deutschen Stoss, which was utilized in a more flexible attacking column. The high military reputation of the Swiss and the Landsknechts again led to the employment of mercenary units across Europe in order to train other armies in their tactics. These two, and others who had adopted their tactics, faced off in several wars, leading to a series of developments as a result. These formations had great successes on the battlefield, starting with the astonishing victories of the Swiss cantons against Charles the Bold of Burgundy in the Burgundian Wars, in which the Swiss participated in 1476 and 1477. In the battles of Grandson, Morat and Nancy, the Swiss not only successfully resisted the attacks of enemy knights, as the relatively passive Scottish and Flemish infantry squares had done in the earlier Middle Ages, but also marched to the attack with great speed and in good formation, their attack columns steamrolling the Burgundian forces, sometimes with great massacre. The deep pike attack column remained the primary form of effective infantry combat for the next 40 years, and the Swabian War saw the first conflict in which both sides had large formations of well-trained pikemen. After that war, its combatants, the Swiss and their Landsknecht imitators, would often face each other again in the Italian Wars, which would become in many ways the military proving ground of the Renaissance. Contemporary Japan experienced a parallel evolution of pole weapons. The Japanese style of warfare was, however, generally fast-moving and aggressive with far shallower formations than their European equivalents. The naginata and yari became common weapons for Japanese ashigaru foot soldiers and dismounted samurai due to the greater reach than swords, which samurai also carried. Naginata, first used around 750 AD, had a curved sword-like blade on a wood shaft with a metal counterweight, often spiked. It was used more with a slashing action and forced the introduction of sonorate as cavalry battles became more important. Yari were spears of varying lengths. The straight blade usually had sharpened edges, sometimes protrusions from the central blade, and fitted to a hollowed shaft with an extremely long tang. Around later half of 16th century, pikemen holding pikes with length of 4.5 to 6.5 meters or sometimes 10 meters became main forces in armies. They formed lines, combined with arquebusiers and short spearmen. Pikemen formed 2 or 3 rows of line, and were forced to move up and down their pikes in unison under the command. Finally, the rise of firearms and artillery in the 16th century made the large formations consisting entirely of pikemen vulnerable to being shot down despite their awesome close combat power. The decline of the combat column of pikemen was starkly displayed at the terrible Battle of Bicocca in 1522, for instance, where arquebusiers contributed to the heavy defeat of a force of Swiss pikemen, pike and shot. In the aftermath of the Italian Wars, from the end of the 15th century to the late 16th century, most European armies adopted the use of the pike, often in conjunction with primitive firearms such as the arquebus and caliver to form large pike and shot formations. The quintessential example of this development was the Spanish tercio, which consisted of a large square of pikemen with small, mobile squadrons of arquebusiers moving along its perimeter, as well as traditional men-at-arms. These three elements formed a mutually supportive combination of tactical roles. The arquebusiers harried the enemy line, the pikemen protected the arquebusiers from enemy cavalry charges, and the men-at-arms, typically armed with swords and javelins, fought off enemy pikemen when two opposing squares made contact. The tercio deployed smaller numbers of pikemen than the huge Swiss and Landsknecht columns, and the formation ultimately proved to be much more flexible on the battlefield. Mixed formations of men quickly became the norm for European infantrymen, with many, but not all, seeking to imitate the tercio. In England, a combination of billmen, longbowmen, and men-at-arms remained the norm, though this changed when the supply of use on the island dwindled. The percentage of men who were armed with firearms in tercio-like formations steadily increased as firearms advanced in technology. This advance is believed to be the demise of cavalry when in fact it revived it. In the late 16th into the 17th century, smaller pike formations were used, invariably defending attached musketeers, often as a central block with two subunits of shooters, called sleeves of shot, on either side of the pikes. Although the cheaper and versatile infantry increasingly adopted firearms, cavalry's proportion in the army remained high. During this period the pike was typically 4.5 to 5.5 meters in length. The pike was also said to be 10 to 14 feet long.